Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of lost love, redemption, and the extraordinary power of second chances that can heal even the deepest wounds of the past. Enjoy the story. The crisp autumn air nipped at James Holloway's weathered face as he sat on a park bench, his gaze fixed on a worn photograph. At 65, James was a man haunted by his past, his steel-gray eyes clouded with regret as he traced the outline of the woman in the picture. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice catching, "what I wouldn't give to turn back time." As a cool breeze rustled the golden leaves around him, James closed his eyes, allowing himself to be transported back to a time when life was full of promise and second chances seemed unnecessary. An elderly couple walked by, hand in hand, their laughter floating on the breeze. James watched them, a lump forming in his throat. "That could have been us, Rachel," he thought. "If only I hadn't been such a fool." He looked down at the photo again, remembering the day it was taken, Rachel's 25th birthday, a picnic in this very park. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of love and trust he had betrayed. "I'm sorry," he murmured, a single tear sliding down his cheek. "I'm so sorry." 30 years earlier, James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. At 35, he was a rising star in the financial world. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight was about Rachel. "You can do this, James," he muttered to his reflection, patting the small velvet box in his pocket. "She's the one. You know it." He rehearsed his proposal one more time, his palms sweaty with anticipation. "Rachel, we've been together for 5 years now, and I can't imagine spending another day without you. Will you marry me?" Just as he was about to leave, a sharp knock at the door startled him. Puzzled, he opened it to find a vision that would alter the course of his life forever. Olivia Kane stood before him, a whirlwind in human form. Her wild red hair framed a face that promised adventure, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Hey, neighbor," she purred, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm locked out. Mind if I use your phone?" James felt his carefully laid plans begin to crumble as Olivia sauntered past him, her perfume leaving him dizzy. "So sure," he stammered, closing the door behind her. Olivia turned, her gaze sweeping over him appreciatively. "Well, don't you look dapper? Hot date?" James fingered the box in his pocket, suddenly unsure. I'm meeting Rachel." Olivia's eyebrow arched. "Ah, the girlfriend. You know, James, you're too young to tie yourself down. There's a whole world out there waiting to be explored." As she spoke, she moved closer, her presence intoxicating. James found himself backing away until he hit the wall. I love Rachel," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Olivia's laugh was low and seductive. "Love? Or comfort? Come on, James. When was the last time you did something truly wild?" In that moment, as Olivia's eyes challenged him, James felt a part of himself he didn't know existed stir to life. A part that craved danger, excitement, and the unknown. Little did he know, he had just closed the door on his future with Rachel. What followed was a tornado of passion that swept James off his feet. Olivia was everything Rachel wasn't, spontaneous, daring, and utterly unpredictable. "Live a little, James," Olivia laughed as they raced through the streets of New York at midnight, the cool air whipping through their hair. "There's a whole world out there waiting for us." And live they did. From impromptu trips to Paris to skinny dipping in the Hamptons, James found himself intoxicated by Olivia's zest for life. Rachel became a distant memory, a quiet voice of reason drowned out by the siren call of adventure. One particularly wild night, as they danced on the rooftop of a Manhattan skyscraper, Olivia grabbed James by his shirt collar. "Let's leave," she whispered, her eyes gleaming. "Tonight, right now, just you and me." James didn't hesitate. "Where to?" he asked, his heart racing. Olivia threw her head back and laughed. "Anywhere, everywhere. Does it matter?" The next morning, as they boarded a plane to Rio de Janeiro, James felt a momentary pang of guilt. He thought of Rachel, waiting for him, worried sick. He should call her, explain. "What's wrong, baby?" Olivia asked, noticing his frown. James looked at her, at the promise of excitement in her eyes, and made his choice. "Nothing," he said, leaning in to kiss her. "Everything's perfect." And just like that, they were gone. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just two silhouettes disappearing into the night, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered dreams. For 5 years, James and Olivia blazed across the country like a comet, burning bright and fast. But as with all comets, their trajectory was unsustainable. "I'm suffocating, James," Olivia screamed during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. They stood in the living room of their lavish Los Angeles apartment, the city lights twinkling indifferently below. "Is this all there is? Work, home, repeat?" James ran his hands through his hair, exasperated. "What more do you want, Olivia? We have everything." She laughed bitterly. "Everything except freedom. Don't you see? We're trapped in a gilded cage." James stared at her, bewildered. "Trapped? We can go anywhere, do anything. How is that a cage?" Olivia's eyes flashed with anger. "Because it's all so predictable now. Where's the excitement, James? Where's the man who dropped everything to run away with me?" "He grew up," James snapped. "Maybe it's time you did too." The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he'd made a mistake. Olivia's face hardened, all the warmth draining from her eyes. "I see," she said coldly. "Well, if that's how you feel, maybe it's time I found someone who still knows how to live." The next morning, Olivia was gone, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note. "Found a new adventure. Don't wait up." "Oh!" James stood in the empty apartment, the echo of her absence deafening. He had given up everything for her, and now he was left with nothing but success that tasted like ashes in his mouth. As he sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, James finally allowed himself to think of Rachel. Sweet, steady Rachel, who he had discarded so carelessly. He wondered where she was, if she ever thought of him, if she had found someone who deserved her. For the first time in 5 years, James wept. 25 years passed in a blur of boardrooms and balance sheets. James Holloway became a titan of industry, his name synonymous with success. But behind the facade of the powerful CEO lurked a lonely man, haunted by the ghosts of his past. As his 60th birthday approached, James found himself drawn back to his hometown of Millbrook, New York. The quaint streets were a far cry from the bustling metropolises he was used to, but something about the place called to him. He parked his luxury car on Main Street, feeling out of place in his designer suit. As he walked down the familiar sidewalk, memories assaulted him at every turn. There was the ice cream parlor where he and Rachel had shared their first kiss, the park where they had picnicked countless times, the jewelry store where he had bought the engagement ring he never got to give her. "Excuse me," he asked an elderly woman tending to her garden. "I'm looking for information about Rachel Thompson. She used to live here years ago." The woman's face fell. "Oh dear, Rachel's at the Sunset Valley Hospice now. Cancer, poor thing. Not much time left, they say." James felt the world tilt on its axis. "Thank you," he managed to croak out before stumbling back to his car. As he gripped the steering wheel, memories flooded back. Rachel's gentle smile, her quiet strength, the future they had planned together. And he had thrown it all away. "Please," he whispered to whatever higher power might be listening. "Give me one more chance to make things right." With shaking hands, he started the car and headed towards the hospice, his heart pounding with fear and hope. The antiseptic smell of the hospice assaulted James's senses as he walked down the sterile hallway. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through his veins. Room 317. This was it. Taking a deep breath, James pushed open the door. The sight that greeted him nearly brought him to his knees. Rachel lay in the hospital bed, a pale shadow of the vibrant young woman he had known. But when her eyes met his, he saw a flicker of recognition, and then, miraculously, a smile. "James?" she whispered, her voice weak but warm. "Is it really you?" He rushed to her bedside, taking her frail hand in his. "Rachel, I'm so sorry," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I was a fool. Can you ever forgive me?" Rachel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Oh, James, I forgave you long ago. I'm just glad you found your way back." James sank into the chair beside her bed. overwhelmed by her grace. "How can you forgive me so easily after what I did?" Rachel's laugh was soft, tinged with sadness. "It wasn't easy, James. It took years. But holding on to anger, it only hurts yourself in the end." James marveled at her strength, her capacity for forgiveness. It made his betrayal seem even more heinous. "I don't deserve you, Rachel. I never did." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Don't say that. We all make mistakes, James. What matters is that you're here now." As they talked, James learned about the life he had missed. Rachel had married, had a daughter, been widowed. She spoke of her joys and sorrows with a quiet dignity that moved James deeply. "I wish I had been there for you," he said softly. "I wish I could go back and change everything." Rachel shook her head. "We can't change the past, James, but we're here now. That's what matters." In that moment, James made a silent vow. He would spend whatever time Rachel had left making up for the years he had stolen from them. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. James moved heaven and earth to give Rachel everything she had ever dreamed of, starting with the wedding they should have had 30 years ago. The small chapel in the hospice was transformed into a fairy tale setting. Flowers adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance a stark contrast to the usual clinical smell. As "Here Comes the Bride" played softly in the background, James turned to see Rachel being wheeled down the aisle. Despite her illness, she was radiant in a simple white dress, a smile of pure joy lighting up her face. "Dearly beloved," the chaplain began, his voice ringing out in the hushed room, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found their way back to each other." As they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The medical staff, who had become Rachel's second family, sniffled quietly, moved by the palpable love between the couple. "I, James, take you, Rachel, to be my lawfully wedded wife," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish every moment we have together, for as long as we both shall live." Rachel's voice was soft but steady as she repeated the vows. "I, Rachel, take you, James, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, forgive you, and treasure the gift of this second chance we've been given." As James leaned down to kiss his bride, he silently renewed his vow to make every remaining moment count. The reception was a small but joyous affair. Rachel's daughter, Emma, couldn't attend due to complications with her pregnancy, but she sent her love and blessings via video call. As James and Rachel shared their first dance, swaying gently to their song, James whispered, "I love you, Rachel. I always have, even when I was too foolish to realize it." Rachel rested her head on his chest. Her eyes closed in contentment. "I love you too, James. Thank you for making an old woman's dream come true." James held her tighter, wishing he could freeze this moment forever. For 6 precious weeks, James and Rachel lived a lifetime of love. He read to her, held her hand through difficult treatments, and listened enraptured as she shared stories of the life he had missed. But as autumn gave way to winter, Rachel's condition deteriorated rapidly. On a cold December morning, as the first snow of the season fell outside her window, Rachel opened her eyes and smiled at James. "It's time, my love," she said softly. James felt his heart constrict. "No, Rachel, please, just a little longer." She reached up to touch his face. "James, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Thank you for coming back to me." "How can I go on without you?" James asked, his voice breaking. Rachel's smile was serene. "By living, James, by loving. Promise me you'll open your heart again. There's so much love left in you to give." James nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He held her hand, watching as her breathing slowed, became shallower. With her last breath, Rachel whispered, "I love you, James. Always." And then she was gone, slipping away peacefully in her sleep. James's hand clasped tightly in hers. The funeral was a small, somber affair. As James stood by the graveside, he felt a hollowness that threatened to consume him. But amidst the grief, there was also gratitude for the brief time they had been given. "Goodbye, my love," he whispered, as he placed a single red rose on her casket. "Thank you for teaching me the true meaning of love and forgiveness." As he turned to leave, James noticed a young woman standing at a distance, her pregnant belly evident even under her coat. Their eyes met briefly before she turned and hurried away. James frowned, something nagging at the back of his mind, but the thought slipped away as he was enveloped in a fog of grief. 40 days after Rachel's passing, James sat in his newly purchased Millbrook home, staring at her photograph. The house felt empty, a reflection of the void in his heart. He had thrown himself into philanthropy, establishing a foundation in Rachel's name to help single mothers and children in need. It gave him purpose, but the loneliness remained. A sharp knock at the door startled him from his reverie. Curious, he opened it to find a young woman, heavily pregnant, standing on his porch. With a jolt, he recognized her from the funeral. "Mr. Holloway?" she asked, hesitantly. "I'm Emma. I'm looking for work. I was told you might need help around the house." There was something familiar about her eyes that tugged at James's memory. "Come in," he found himself saying, stepping aside to let her enter. Over the next few days, Emma breathed life back into the house and unknowingly into James himself. Her gentle presence and quiet efficiency reminded him so much of Rachel that it both comforted and pained him. One evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Emma began to open up about her past. "I never knew my father," she said softly, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I grew up thinking he had abandoned us before I was born, but recently I received a letter from my mother. She told me the truth." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Your mother," he said carefully. "What was her name?" Emma's eyes met his, brimming with unshed tears. Rachel Thompson." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the pieces fell into place. James stared at Emma, seeing Rachel's eyes looking back at him, and knew that his journey of redemption was far from over. "Oh my God," James whispered, his hand trembling as he reached out towards Emma. You're my daughter?" Emma nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Mom told me everything in her letter. She said she found out she was pregnant after you left. She wanted me to know the truth in case I ever met you." James felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He had a daughter, a child he never knew existed, a child he had abandoned before she was even born. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm the reason you grew up without a father. I left before Rachel knew she was pregnant. If I had known—" Emma's reaction surprised him. Instead of anger, her face softened with understanding. "Life is complicated," she said gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to make things right." In that moment, James saw Rachel's forgiving spirit shining through their daughter, and he knew he had been given yet another chance at redemption. "I want to make things right," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can never make up for all the years I missed, but if you'll let me, I want to be a part of your life, and your child's life." Emma smiled through her tears. "I'd like that. Mom always said you had a good heart, despite your mistakes. I think she'd be happy to see us together." James felt a warmth spread through his chest at Rachel's posthumous forgiveness. "Your mother was an incredible woman. I wish you could have seen us together these past few weeks. I wish I had been there all along." The next few months were a whirlwind of emotions as James and Emma navigated their newfound relationship. There were awkward moments and tearful conversations, but also laughter and a growing sense of family. James threw himself into preparing for his grandchild's arrival with the same enthusiasm he once reserved for corporate takeovers. He converted one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery, sparing no expense on the finest crib, changing table, and rocking chair money could buy. "Dad," Emma laughed one day as James struggled to assemble a particularly complex baby swing. "You know the baby won't care if their swing was made by NASA engineers, right?" James looked up, a screwdriver clenched between his teeth, and felt his heart swell at being called Dad. It was still new, still wonderful every time he heard it. "Maybe not," he said, grinning, "but their grandfather cares. Only the best for my grandchild." As Emma's due date approached, James found himself growing more and more anxious. He hired the best obstetrician in the state to oversee Emma's care and insisted on accompanying her to every appointment. "I wasn't there for your birth," he told Emma softly one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset. "I'll be damned if I miss my grandchild's." Emma squeezed his hand. "You're here now, Dad. That's what matters." When Emma went into labor, James was by her side, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement. As the first cries of his grandson filled the hospital room, James felt a love he had never known before wash over him. Holding the tiny bundle in his arms, he looked at Emma with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me a chance to be the father I should have been all along." Emma smiled tiredly from the hospital bed. "Thanks, Dad," she said, the words sending a thrill through James's heart. "For being here now." As James gazed down at his grandson's innocent face, he made a silent promise to Rachel, wherever she was. He would love and protect their family with every fiber of his being, honoring the precious gift of this second chance. "What's his name?" James asked softly, unable to take his eyes off the newborn. Emma's voice was filled with love as she replied, "Nathan, it means gift." "Nathan," James repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, Nathan, I'm your grandpa, and I promise I'll always be here for you." In that hospital room, surrounded by the love of his daughter and grandson, James Holloway finally found the redemption he had been seeking all his life. It wasn't the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with the joy, love, and family he had almost lost forever. 5 years later, James sat on the same park bench where our story began. But this time, he wasn't alone. 5-year-old Nathan sat beside him, his legs swinging as he eagerly licked an ice cream cone. "Grandpa," Nathan said, looking up at James with Rachel's eyes, "tell me again about Grandma Rachel." James smiled, his heart full. "Well, buddy, your Grandma Rachel was the kindest, most forgiving person I ever knew. She taught me that it's never too late to make things right, to love and be loved." As he spoke, James saw Emma approaching, pushing a stroller with Nathan's new baby sister inside. His family, his redemption, his second chance at love. James looked up at the sky, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves above him. "Thank you, Rachel," he whispered, "for everything." And somewhere, he could almost hear Rachel's gentle laugh on the wind, blessing the family she had brought together.